The night was alive with music, the chandeliers glowing like captured stars, and the millionaire's mansion brimmed with guests who whispered and laughed in elegant tones, their gowns sweeping the polished floor as if they owned the night itself. But among the glitter and pride moved a young maid with her tray, her steps careful, her head bowed, her uniform plain compared to the sparkling dresses around her, and though she did not seek attention, attention found her, cruel and sharp, when a group of wealthy guests turned their gaze toward her, their eyes gleaming with amusement, and one of them, smirking as though he had discovered the perfect way to pass time, raised his glass and mocked that if she dared to dance a waltz that evening, she should become the bride of the millionaire's son, a suggestion that sent waves of laughter rolling across the hall, the kind of laughter that bites more than words, making her heart twist as she tried to keep her face calm, because she had grown used to whispers and mockery, but never had she been pushed into the center of a cruel game, yet no one there knew the truth of her life, the truth buried deep beneath her quiet steps and simple smile. 4 years ago her world was filled with music and dance, her body once moving with such grace that people clapped and admired, but life had changed, storms had swept through her dreams, and she had traded the stage for the shadowed corners of a mansion, hiding the part of herself that once burned bright, and now, as the laughter echoed, those forgotten pieces of her heart stirred as though awakened, her hands trembling slightly as she balanced the tray but her mind replaying old rhythms, her feet almost itching to move with the music drifting from the orchestra, and yet she stayed still, because what would it mean to step forward, to accept their challenge? Would it be foolishness or defiance, or would it be the moment she finally reclaimed something she had lost, while the crowd, still laughing, believed she would never dare, that she was nothing more than a maid meant to stay in the background, invisible unless someone needed service or entertainment? But the more they laughed, the more the suspense in the hall thickened, like a rope pulled tighter with each cruel word, for hidden behind her silence was not fear but something else entirely, something that made her eyes flash for the briefest moment though most missed it, except perhaps the millionaire's son who stood quietly at the side, watching the scene unfold, his face unreadable, though even his presence added to the strange electricity that filled the air, as if something far greater than a game was about to begin, and though she lowered her gaze, her heart beat in a rhythm only she understood, each note of the waltz pulling her closer to a choice that could change everything, for she knew that if she danced, the world would never look at her the same again, and if she refused, their laughter would chase her forever. And so, while the night continued with glitter and music, a storm brewed quietly within her soul, unseen but powerful, ready to turn the game of mockery into something unforgettable, leaving every guest in that hall on the edge of a story they never expected to witness, a story that was only beginning and would soon turn their laughter into silence, their smirks into wide eyes, when the maid they had dismissed revealed the truth they never imagined. The music in the hall swelled as if the orchestra itself sensed the tension, the laughter of the guests still floating in the air, sharp and mocking, and the maid stood frozen for a moment, her tray clutched in her hands, her heart pounding louder than the violins, as the challenge hung between her and the crowd like a knife. Yet it was not just a cruel joke anymore, it had become a test of pride, dignity, and courage, for every eye in that glittering hall waited for her reaction, convinced she would shrink away, and the mocking smiles grew wider as whispers spread, people nudging one another, eager to see the maid stumble or refuse, but deep inside her chest the echo of old rhythms stirred, those memories of polished dance floors, of applause, of being someone who once belonged to the world of light and music, and though years of hardship had pushed that part of her into silence, it had never died, only hidden beneath the weight of survival, and now, faced with mockery, it rose again. Like a fire long smothered, flickering into life, making her fingers tighten and her breathing steady as she slowly set the tray aside, the hall falling into a hush so sudden that even the musicians faltered for a beat, for no one truly believed she would step forward, yet she did, moving with quiet determination to the open space at the center of the ballroom, where the polished floor reflected the glow of chandeliers like a stage waiting for its performer, and as she stood there, the crowd leaned closer, some smirking, others curious, all of them expecting to watch her embarrassment, but her eyes did not show fear, they carried a glimmer of something else, something most could not name but that unsettled them all the same, and the millionaire who had mocked her leaned back in his chair with an amused smile, certain that the maid was about to provide entertainment and nothing more, while his son, standing at the edge of the room, felt something shift inside him, for he saw in her posture not the submission of a servant but the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and the silence stretched as the musicians glanced at one another until finally, the conductor lifted his hand and the first notes of a waltz began to flow again, filling the hall with a melody both elegant and powerful, and in that moment, the maid closed her eyes for a heartbeat, letting the music seep into her veins, guiding her like an old friend she had once lost and now found again. And when she opened them, she moved, not with hesitation but with grace so fluid that the crowd gasped, the sound sharp and full of disbelief, for the steps she took were not clumsy nor timid but perfect, refined, and filled with a beauty that silenced even the cruelest whispers, her skirt swirling gently as she glided across the floor, her body following the rhythm with the ease of someone who had lived for this very art, and each turn, each movement spoke of years of training hidden behind the disguise of a maid's uniform, the chandeliers above catching her every motion like they had been waiting for her all along, and the guests who had mocked her now stared with wide eyes, their laughter caught in their throats, unable to look away from the unexpected display, and the millionaire's mocking smirk began to fade, replaced by something else: confusion, disbelief, even unease as he realized that what was meant to be humiliation had turned into revelation, while his son's gaze remained fixed, almost mesmerized, for in her steps he saw more than skill, he saw strength, dignity, and a story untold, and as she danced, the hall transformed, no longer a place of mockery but a stage where truth revealed itself, the truth that appearances could never capture the depth of a person, and still she moved, her breath steady, her eyes bright, until the music carried her into a final graceful spin that left her standing tall at the center of the floor, the last note hanging in the air like a secret before it dissolved into silence, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop, the entire hall frozen in awe, their disbelief so thick it could almost be touched, until at last a sound broke the silence, not laughter, not mockery, but the hesitant clap of someone at the back, quickly joined by another, and then another, until the hall filled with applause, reluctant at first but growing stronger as the weight of what they had witnessed sank in, and though many clapped with unease, knowing their earlier mockery now looked foolish, others clapped with genuine admiration, their eyes unable to hide the respect her dance demanded, and she, standing there with her chest rising and falling from the effort, did not bow her head like a servant but held it high, her gaze sweeping the hall with quiet defiance, for she had answered their challenge in a way none had expected, turning their cruel game into a moment that belonged to her, a moment they could never erase, and though the night would continue, though the guests would try to reclaim their pride with more whispers and excuses, the truth of that dance would linger, etched into every memory, and the story of the maid who dared to accept the unexpected challenge had only just begun. The applause still echoed faintly in the hall, but the maid stood frozen in the center of the polished floor, her heart still racing from the dance, her breath coming in soft waves as if the music still lingered inside her, and though the sound of clapping had ended, silence returned heavier than before, for the crowd could not decide what to do next, their eyes locked on her as though she had turned from invisible to unforgettable in a matter of minutes, and yet it was not the dance alone that unsettled them but the way she had carried herself, as if she belonged in the spotlight more than any of them, and in that silence she felt both powerful and exposed, her mind pulling back memories she had tried to bury, of countless hours of practice in dim halls, of teachers who once told her she had something rare, of competitions where her name had been called to applause not as a servant but as a champion, and all of it swirled inside her like a storm, making the present moment both sweet and painful, for though she had danced beautifully, the truth of her life had not changed. She was still a maid, still someone mocked and underestimated, yet something deep inside her whispered that this was only the first step, the start of something she could not yet see but could feel burning like a flame in her chest, And as she stood, uncertain whether to bow or walk away, the son of the millionaire moved forward, each step deliberate, his eyes never leaving her, his expression unreadable. And the crowd held their breath, for they wanted to see if he would dismiss her like the others or if he would dare to do something that would upset the balance of pride and power in the room. And when he reached her, he extended his hand, the simple gesture shocking enough to stir fresh whispers among the guests, who leaned closer, unable to believe what they were seeing, for his hand was not one of mockery but of respect, as though he was inviting her to dance again. And in that moment the maid hesitated, her heart clashing with her mind, torn between the urge to step back into safety and the longing to take a risk. But the son's eyes held no cruelty, no games, only a quiet steadiness that made her believe he truly wanted her to accept. And so, after a pause that felt like eternity, she placed her hand in his, and the hall seemed to shift again, the crowd's unease growing as the music started once more, soft and slow, carrying the two of them into a waltz that felt less like a performance and more like a secret shared between souls. And though she had danced with perfect form moments ago, this time it was different, for now each step carried the weight of two stories colliding, hers of struggle and hidden talent, his of privilege and expectation. And as they moved together, it was as if the floor itself held its breath, the guests reduced to shadows at the edges while the two figures in the center became the only truth, her movements blending with his in a rhythm so natural it seemed impossible they had never danced together before. And yet behind the grace was tension, for she could feel the eyes on her, the judgment, the disbelief, and she knew that every step she took was more than just a dance, it was a defiance, a statement that she was more than what they saw, more than a maid in uniform, more than a target of laughter. And with every turn the son seemed to understand this too, his hand steady at her back, his eyes never straying from hers, as if he was telling her without words that he saw her truth, not the role she was forced to play. And though she feared what might follow when the music ended, she also knew that this moment was carving itself into history, the first step towards something neither of them could predict. And when the final note rang through the air, leaving them both standing breathless at the center of the room, the silence was even deeper than before, a silence heavy with awe, confusion, and the undeniable knowledge that something had changed, for in the space of a single waltz, a maid had become a dancer again, and a son had shown respect where others had only mocked. And though no one dared to speak it aloud, everyone in the hall felt it that this was only the beginning, the first steps of a story that would not be forgotten, a story that had only just begun to unfold. The hall seemed to hold its breath as the final notes of the waltz faded away, yet the silence that followed was not empty, it was thick with emotions that no one dared to speak, a silence that carried shock, unease, and even admiration, for what had just unfolded in front of their eyes was not merely a dance but something deeper, something that challenged their ideas of status and pride. And at the center of it stood the maid, her chest rising and falling as she tried to calm her racing heart, her eyes still fixed on the polished floor as though she could avoid the weight of so many stares. But no matter how much she tried, she could feel it, the way every gaze burned into her, some filled with disbelief, some with jealousy, and a few, just a few, with respect. And beside her stood the millionaire's son, his presence no less commanding but entirely different in tone, his calm expression almost daring the crowd to question what they had just witnessed. And the contrast between them could not be ignored, the servant and the heir, standing together not as master and maid but as equals in a moment that felt far greater than either of them. And it was then that she realized this dance had become more than a performance, it had become a test of dignity, a silent battle where every step, every turn, every glance had been proof that she was not invisible, not to him and not to the truth of her own spirit. And though part of her longed to retreat, to escape the storm of judgment that would surely follow, another part of her stood tall, her back straight, her chin lifted ever so slightly, for she knew walking away in shame now would erase everything that had just been shown. And so she chose to face the silence, to let it press upon her and not flinch. And this strength, quiet but undeniable, stirred something unexpected in the crowd, for the same guests who had once mocked her were now unsure of their place, unsure if laughter still suited the moment, For laughter now would sound cruel, almost foolish, against the grace they had just witnessed, and so they stayed quiet, watching with restless eyes, waiting for someone to speak first, waiting for someone to break the spell, but no one dared, and in that hesitation, the maid found her own dignity growing, not from their approval but from the fact that their scorn no longer frightened her, for she had proven to herself that she could stand under their gaze and not collapse, and though she could not predict what would come next, she knew that this was the dance of dignity, not just a waltz but a statement, and the son seemed to understand this as well, for when he finally turned to face the guests, his voice calm yet firm, he spoke only a few words, praising the courage and beauty of the dance, words so simple yet so heavy that they hung in the air like truth itself, and though whispers rippled across the hall, no one dared to challenge him, for his tone carried a weight that even wealth could not manufacture. It carried conviction, and standing beside him, the maid felt a strange mixture of fear and relief, for she knew his words would not erase the struggles she faced, nor change the reality of her position, but they did something far more important in that moment. They acknowledged her humanity, her worth, and her talent in front of those who had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a servant in the shadows, and as the night moved on, as conversations picked up again in uneasy fragments, as music returned though with less enthusiasm, she realized she had crossed a line she could never return from, for she had revealed a part of herself she had kept hidden, and though it would bring both admiration and resentment, she did not regret it, for it was better to be seen for who she truly was, even if only for one night, than to remain invisible forever. And as she finally stepped away from the center of the hall, her heart heavy yet strangely light, she knew this was not the end but only another beginning, the continuation of a story that had started with mockery but had grown into something stronger, a story shaped by courage, humility, and the quiet but unshakable power of dignity. The night after the dance lingered in everyone's memory, yet for the maid it was more than a memory, it was the door to a new chapter that she had never dared to imagine, and as dawn crept over the city the following morning, painting the streets with pale light, she awoke not in the comfort of fine silks or soft pillows but in her modest little room, her heart still echoing with the rhythm of the waltz, the sound of violins, and the heavy silence that had followed her performance, and though she had expected to feel fear for what might come next, she instead felt an unusual calm, as if the dance had unlocked a strength within her that could not be taken back. But outside her door, the world was shifting, for whispers spread quickly among the wealthy families who had attended the ball, whispers that began with mockery but slowly bent toward curiosity and even admiration, for people could not stop talking about the servant who had danced like a queen, and while some voices still carried scorn, others carried a grudging respect, for no one could deny what they had witnessed with their own eyes, and the son of the millionaire had not stepped back, had not treated her as less, but had met her as an equal on the floor, and this alone made the story grow larger than anyone intended, and though she herself remained quiet, choosing to move through her duties without complaint, she could feel the change in the air, the way some looked at her with envy, the way others avoided her as though unsure how to act, and though the days were long and the work remained heavy, she carried herself with a new steadiness, for she knew she had survived the storm of mockery and walked away with dignity intact. But change never comes without challenge, and soon enough she found herself standing in front of choices she had never thought would come, for the son himself approached her, not with arrogance but with sincerity, asking if she would consider dancing again, not in secret, not in shame, but openly, as part of a larger gathering, a festival that would be attended by many. And his words startled her, for part of her longed to say yes, to step into the light again and show the world that the first dance had not been a mistake, yet another part of her feared what would follow, for she was no fool, she knew the world of the wealthy was cruel, filled with jealousy and hidden daggers, and she wondered if stepping into that world again would mean sacrificing what little peace she had left. But as she lay awake that night, she realized something important, that fear had already ruled too much of her life, that silence had been her shield for far too long, and now that she had tasted the strength of being seen, she could not go back to being invisible, and so she agreed, her voice trembling but her heart certain, and from that moment the whispers grew louder, spreading beyond the walls of the mansion into the streets, into the hearts of ordinary people who heard. The tale of a maid who danced against mockery and walked away with dignity, and when the day of the festival finally arrived, the air itself seemed charged with anticipation, crowds gathering not just for the celebration but to see if the story was true, to see if a servant could stand among the polished and proud once more, and as she stepped into the open space, the music beginning to rise, she felt the weight of every eye on her again, yet this time it was different, for she did not step forward as someone waiting for permission, she stepped forward as someone who knew her own worth, someone who had already walked through fire and refused to be burned, and when her first step touched the rhythm, the crowd fell silent, just as they had on that unforgettable night, and with each turn, each graceful movement, she gave not just a performance but a piece of her heart, a truth that could not be mocked away, and as the final note rang out, the silence returned, but it was not heavy with judgment, it was alive with awe, and when the applause broke, it was not polite or forced but thunderous, rising from every corner, carried by those who had doubted and those who had believed, and in that moment, she realized that this was no longer about a maid, no longer about a son or a wealthy family, it was about hope, about the possibility that dignity and talent could break through barriers of class and pride, and though she knew her journey was only beginning, that hardship and gossip would still follow her, she also knew she was no longer alone, for her courage had given others courage, her steps had spoken louder than words, and as she stood there, her heart full, her eyes bright with unshed tears, she understood that this was her new beginning, not a perfect one, not an easy one, but one she had chosen, a beginning built on the strength to stand tall, the courage to be seen, and the quiet but unshakable truth that even those who are mocked can rise to dance like kings and queens.